SaaS Backwards is sponsored by Austin Lawrence Group, specializing in demand gen for SaaS. It sure is noisy. I deleted 100 emails from vendors just this morning. Your buyer has gotten better at ignoring you, and you're gonna need a big idea if you want to cut through all that clutter. Austin Lawrence is just the right agency to help you find it. So if your campaigns are falling on deaf eyeballs, let's talk. Visit austinlawrence.com today and let's build something bigger.
Welcome to the SaaS Backwards podcast, where we reverse engineer the success of fast-growing SaaS firms and explore strategies CMOs and CEOs are using to drive their businesses forward.
Welcome to SaaS Backwards, a podcast that helps SaaS CMOs and CEOs to accelerate growth and enhance profitability. Our guest today is Tim Riesterer, Chief Strategy Officer of Corporate Visions, a customer conversation consulting and training company. He and his colleagues have written 3 books, including Conversations That Win the Complex Sale, The 3 Value Conversations, and The Expansion Sale, which is the book we're going to focus on today. Hey, Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ken, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, before we get going, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. We're kind of research nerds in the area, we like to say, of buyer decision science. There's a whole platform of study called human decision science that looks at behavioral economics, neuroscience, social psychology. In other words, how humans frame value and how they make choices. So we study that and apply it to business decisions, whether you're acquiring new logos or keeping and expanding existing customers, and how you get inside your buyer's brain and the stories you tell and the skills with which you tell them in a way to basically win and keep more than your fair share of the business. So it's always changing, always something new. We're running labs, running studies, and then turning that into our consulting and training engagements. So we're always trying to keep up on the latest in terms of why buyers buy and how you can influence that, whether they're a prospect or a customer.
That's awesome. I want to just really dig in. First of all, I always know it's a good book if I start drawing in it. So I got my pencil out, started making my marginalia. So congratulations, really a great book. And I'm going to enjoy finishing it off. I think we have to set the table a little bit. And in the book, you talk to the same thing I've talked to with many of my clients and prospects, which is the acquisition of the new logos gets all the fanfare, but all the money comes after the sale. And can you just sort of set the table for what that really looks like and why SaaS leadership, the C-suite, needs to focus on things other than acquiring new logos?
Yeah, it's hard to acquire new logos. So part of the fanfare is it just takes so much energy, so much juice just to get a new logo. But the lifeline of any SaaS company is clearly the retention and expansion part of this whole thing. I always say that the first deal you get was usually too small, usually underpriced it to try and help get it. Then you overserviced it to try and keep them. It's really the second contract or like that first renewal that starts the stages of profitability. And so the question is, can you keep and grow those customers? And 70 to 80%, that's the average we see of all the companies we work with. 70 to 80%, I should say, we work with about 250 companies each year. 70 to 80% of their revenue target for any given year is existing customer-based revenue, the retention number and the expansion number. So it deserves a strategic look. But often I think SaaS companies thought renewals will kind of take care of themselves. I mean, I know that's an overgeneralization, but the idea is if we service them well and the technology doesn't break, people should keep using it because they thought enough of it to buy it in the first place. The reality is renewing isn't renewing. Renewing in some ways is reselling, and upselling isn't just upselling, it's reselling. And so there's more commercial activities in that existing customer interaction and engagement that you need to be commercially savvy about and how that decision is made and how you can affect it.
So that's the status quo, right? So I'm going to kind of bounce a little bit back and forth between acquisition and retention, but this is that status quo situation. And so what we started talking about was actually, I guess, the subject here, the expansion sale. But I think to really set the table, we have to talk about what happens when we acquire a new customer. There's a lot that goes into that from a decision-making standpoint. Yeah. And then we can go back, I think, to the expansion sale and talk about the defense of it.
No, for sure. Something really interesting that we found was for years we had been teaching, preaching, consulting, and training around this idea of new customer acquisition is hard. You have to defeat status quo bias. You're trying to convince a prospect they need to change and they need to do it now and they need to do it with you. And the reality is their natural bent, which is called status quo bias, we know it sometimes as risk aversion, is they don't want to change. It's almost like you don't want to change and aren't going to change until you really have to change. And the problem is that you have to help sometimes people see that need to change. And your job is to be a catalyst for change when prospects are using someone else or doing it themselves or don't know they need your new thing. It's a very systematic approach to disrupting and defeating and dislodging status quo bias. And that energy that has to go into getting them to see the need to do something different, it's underestimated by people who go after new business. My favorite thing to say is that people don't change to get more or less the same. And too often you sound and look and smell like the same thing they're already doing. And so a lot of work has to go into creating the contrast between what they're doing today and what you can do and help them do different and better tomorrow. So that's what it takes to win the new business. But this concept of status quo bias is really your real enemy. It's not the actual competition, whoever's installed there. The way they're thinking about it is, do I have to change? And they're thinking of it as like your enemy then is inertia. It's this lack of desire to change, status quo bias. Well, the way you flip that on its head when you are the installed incumbent is you have to reframe it and think, guess what? I'm now the status quo bias. And the reality is that you want to leverage that. You want to reinforce that. You want to defend that position. You don't want to talk to your existing customers like they're a new customer. You want to take advantage of that position you have. And the book, The Expansion Sale, talks about how to leverage what we call your incumbent advantage and how to defend your position as the status quo bias while keeping and growing them at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. Only 9 short months ago on an annual contract, you were dislodging the status quo, and now all of a sudden you have to turn around and defend it. And I think it's interesting, many of these organizations don't have like a clear line of sight as to who owns that messaging and who owns that relationship. I think it's in the book, so far as I've gotten, you talk about owning the message, but I think it's also the relationship with that economic buyer, the decision maker who's going to do the renewal.
Yeah, I think so. A couple things happen. First, you have to do a nice job of transitioning from the decider to the doer, because you do have to have some success to report. And so we always talk about, you got a decider to decide to change and set some sort of business case up. Now it's going into the hands of the doers to implement that and get that up and running and make sure it's having the impact that was sold and then bought. But what happens then is that sometimes you get down into doer land, and what you really need to make sure is you keep that strategic altitude with the deciders. And so the main thing with your existing customer is you have to be identifying and then documenting and demonstrating impact, results, outcomes, and being able to report on that on a regular basis. And I think what happens inside of companies is you get a little bit of role confusion. So the seller sold it and maybe the success person implements it. But when you go back to talk to your customer for business reviews and then eventually renewals and then maybe upsells, that becomes a commercial moment. I call those acute commercial moments. They're different than the day in and day out satisfaction and net promoter score and usage and adoption. It's a real commercial moment where the current and future relationship hangs in the balance. And that's where the person who's doing the ongoing sort of build out of the implementation and the success of the implementation has to coordinate very well with if there's still a commercial partner in account management or sales. And what we talk about in the book is how to have a common language, a common approach, a common story when both maybe the day-to-day relationship holder and the account relationship holder have to show up at those commercial moments. Business reviews, renewals, and upsells. So we literally say the 4 must-win commercial moments of the client relationship where the relationship holder and let's say the quota holder have to work together.
Well, yeah, I mean, most of the companies we work with, sales has some ongoing interest in those renewal conversations. It's sort of the back end, right, of their deals. So they're going to be involved, and we need to make sure they have good messaging. Is marketing the organization that ought to, own that conversation, or at least that playbook? Like, how do we decide who should have that playbook as a responsibility? Because it's everybody, like the marketing messaging should carry the same message as sales, as success, right? So how do we decide who owns that playbook?
Well, the first thing we tried to do is do research around how to frame up that message for each of those moments. Like, what should a business review agenda contain? What should be the choreography of that business review when you're in the contract, trying to demonstrate the impact, demonstrate the investment and the outcomes, and begin to plant seeds for the future conversation around renewal and upsell. So what should that business review agenda, presentation, if you will, deck, look like and sound like? And then there's, of course, the moment of renewal. That's a trackable thing that you can trigger some communication against. And it too has its own sort of moment where there's a renewal proposal and presentation. And then finally, cross-sell, we got an entire choreography for how you tell that story and share that message. Because if you have a new product that you want to sell to your existing customers, and that same new product is something you want to win new business with, you have to tell completely different stories. So what we've tried to do is identify is how does the story sound based on the psychology of the existing customer? And so I guess in your company, if you're listening to this, who's in charge of building the business review agenda presentation deck? Who's in charge of triggering some communication cadence to existing customers around renewal time? Who's in charge of running some cross-sell campaigns to go grab some of the white space at your customers and then leverage the frameworks that we've developed for each of those moments? And it is a joint venture. Marketing is sometimes running campaigns over the top of what customer success and sales are doing. We've seen a second funnel emerge at companies, like literally a separate funnel, demand gen from customer marketing. And the customer marketing teams are using what we're talking about in this research for their work in terms of renewals and cross-sells and upsells. So it's not dissimilar to demand gen, where marketing's running campaigns and running air cover, but sales is going in and doing some targeted work and maybe running some specific prospect-oriented campaigns. I think you almost have to think of it as its own distinct commercial moment where all the commercial teams have to coordinate.
I want to sort of give people the breadth of the propositions, the 4 whys. So we have Simon Sinek, start with why, but we have 4 whys now. Can you sort of just run us through them and their relevancy to what you uncovered in your research and what you do in the book?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where when you think about why and how and what, Simon Sinek has you interrogating yourself and why you do what you do and how you do it, right? And what makes it distinct. These whys in our book are what the customer's asking themselves. So we like to think of buying anymore is not buying, it's deciding. And a buyer, a decider, has to answer some questions for themselves. And one of the first ones that they ask after, time in your contract is, why should I stay? So we call this framework the why stay. That's the renewal framework that we've developed, if you will, the messaging and content choreography for having the renewal conversation. So they're saying, why should I stay? Why should I keep on keeping on? The second why that they ask often is, why should I pay more? Because remember what I said, sometimes you undersell that first deal, or for a variety of reasons, you're building more capability into the renewal solution. You're going to ask them for a price increase. And we did some deliberate studying on what we call why pay more. The customer is going, I thought what I paid before was just fine. Why should I pay more? So why should I stay? Why should I pay more? And then sometimes we admit that during a relationship with a customer, things don't always go perfect. There's problems, there's service issues, maybe supply chain issues. And the customer's asking themselves, why should I forgive this company? Why should I forgive this partner? We've done work around the apology framework. There is a layer of science out there around apologizing to create even greater loyalty after a service problem than if you never had one before. So if you're following along, it's why stay for renewals, why pay more for price increases, why forgive when there's a service problem. And then the fourth one is why evolve? Why should I do more with you? Why should I expand my relationship with you? We say why evolve. So again, these are what customers are asking themselves. And what we've studied is what's the best framework for your messaging and content and presentation back to them in each of those 4 commercial moments. Why stay renewal? Why pay more price increase? Why forgive, apologizing for any service problems along the way? And why evolve? Why should they buy the next upsell or cross-sell from you? And I think what helps there is that creates a customer centricity, like a natural customer centricity, because you're helping to facilitate the answer of the question your customer is asking, not foisting some sort of content or question on them.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because for some time I've been saying that, we have to be answering the questions they're asking themselves. And to see it in a research context and, some practice notes, I think is really awesome. On that, there was one little vignette in the book that I've gotten to so far about this positive and negative bias, right? Like, I don't know if it was bias is the right word, but where you frame a decision with the positive or the negative, like loss or gain.
Right.
Have I given you enough to run with that?
Sure. And it plays a role in both the new business acquisition and in customer expansion. The premise is a piece of science that won a Nobel Prize by Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Dr. Amos Tversky called prospect theory. And what they discovered is, under the idea of prospect theory, is that people are 2 to 3 times more likely to make a decision to change or do something different to avoid loss than to get a gain. So we often try to sell based on the gain that people can get. But the way you help people see the need to do something different or do the next thing is to perceive what they're currently doing more so as a loss to be avoided versus viewing your solution as a possible gain to be attained. Because the potential gain is only that. It's just potential. It's maybe something I don't have today, but it doesn't make people leap out of their seats to make that move. The reason people will actually make a move to change is if they believe where they are, what they're doing, their status quo is no longer safe. So when you sell something, you got to help them see that their current approach is no longer scalable, tenable, acceptable. It has to feel uncertain. It has to feel a little unsafe so that they will look at a new alternative. You use that same technique when you're trying to convince the doers that they need to implement appropriately and generate adoption. You have to help them see that they can't keep doing it the old way, that the company has made a decision because there's a better, different way. And so as somebody who's on the side of SaaS implementations and renewals and expansion, you have to tell some why change stories that help people see their current situation as unsafe, their status quo is unsafe, so that they will move to using your new approach and you get the results and the adoption and the usage that you want. So you have to appeal to and defeat status quo bias that way, through loss aversion, it's called, versus gain attainment. It's just a truth that people will not move for something that could potentially be a little better, but they will move if they think they can't stay where they are. That's just the science of it. And then later on in your customer relationship, that kind of comes back a little bit, where you literally try to paint any change they would make to another vendor as a potential loss.
As loss.
Like they have to see that, boy, you've had all this impact with them and they've had all these really good results and outcome. Even if it's not topping the charts, like it's progress, you want to paint that picture because they're like, why would I change now and give up all this progress that we've made? Even if we haven't made it to 100%, we're halfway there. There's this something that goes on in the mind. It's called anchoring. And if you anchor somebody on that positive progress that you've made, they're less willing to change because they think there's something they're going to lose. The other thing that's interesting is you also anchor them on the investment that both sides have made in each other, sometimes referred to as onboarding costs or system integration costs or process change management costs, or you name it. There's a lot of time, money, and stomach lining that go into an implementation, right? And so you need to paint that picture for your existing customer. Hey, look at all the people hours that everybody's put in, you, us. Look at all the hard costs in the onboarding systems integration that you had to do, the nomenclature change. Do you really want to do that again? So all of a sudden, by documenting your impact and then documenting the mutual investment, they now see a change as a loss, because they might have to give up that progress they've made and they might have to redo all of that cost that they've sunk. So you have to defeat it. When you're trying to win the new business, you want to defend, reinforce, and otherwise raise it up. So people are like, wow, that could be a big loss if I make a change right now. And unless you document it, unless you share it, they could forget it. And that's what you want to protect against. You want to package that up so they see the competitor as risky business, because look at all the goodness I've got from these folks.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I can't help but think about all the SaaS companies that put ROI calculators on their websites. They must look like great prospects for your consulting services. Because it's like, there it is, right in black and white. We're going to try and sell you the gain. And, it may be that people just aren't ready to take that in at that point in the relationship, right? It might almost make more sense 9 months in. Hey, let's talk about all the gains we've made, right?
Yeah, I think if you have a gain-based calculator, you also need current situation loss calculator, because that's going to move the needle. And then you just add it to the gain and it looks like an even bigger number. But the problem is most people are just promoting like, here's your ROI, here's your TCO. And those are interesting numbers. But as the brain makes decisions, those numbers help you justify a decision. The decision is driven by your desire to leave that loss. And then when you tell yourself and everybody else, here's why I moved, you share, look at all this goodness.
Look at all this goodness. So we need a total loss calculator.
You need a more complete ROI calculator. Like, here's the total loss, here's the potential gain. Now let's sum that up. And here's the window between what you're doing today and what we can offer tomorrow, that whole thing together. But know that they each have a different job to play. The loss convinces somebody to change. The gain is how they explain it to everybody.
Well, I think that was a really great pearl. I hope to see somebody take that up. Certainly, we're going to try and figure out how to do that. So can we talk about the hard kind of benefits that you've seen? You have a couple hundred clients a year that you're working with. This sounds good, but I want to know what's actually in it for people to adopt this kind of thinking and, to work with a firm like yours. And I think in the prep session, you had mentioned there were a few things that you'd be happy to talk about in terms of tangibles on outcome of applying these techniques, which I think are really fascinating.
Yeah. So let's take new business and acquisition, and then we'll talk about expansion. So going out and defeating and disrupting status quo bias. So the only way that happens is you have to help, like I said, somebody see risk in their current approach. They have to feel their current approach is somehow unsafe. So you actually have to introduce some risk, and you have to do it early. And we have a client where they tracked all of this in their call recording. And what they could see in their new business calls is which sellers adopted that model in their discovery of introducing a little bit of risk, introducing a little bit of loss with current approaches versus those who held back and said, no, I don't work that way. I just want to do traditional open-ended question discovery and be really strategic that way. The argument would be you're probably adding more value and more strategic if you show somebody something they didn't know about a problem or the size of the opportunity they were missing. But, sometimes people just don't want to introduce risk in discovery. Well, all that to say, those who did saw close rates of 32%. Those who didn't saw continued average close rates of 19%. So there was a significant correlation based on actually listening to the calls, tracking the use of risk or not using risk in discovery to an almost double close rate, which validates all the science that we said is you have to bring energy to disrupt status quo bias and get more people to choose to change. Moving from 19% to 32% is a big deal. If the main thing you did was sort of obey the laws of status quo physics, and that is introduce the necessary uncertainty to persuade people. So that I would argue the 19% were probably going to make a decision regardless. Your ability to get some people to accelerate a decision, especially nowadays where people are sort of holding out, like people just won't move with urgency if they don't believe that their status quo is uncertain or a loss to be avoided. Now, on the flip side, we worked with expansion. So we worked with a client who had a separate aftermarket sales team. So they sell a platform, and then that would be turned over to a team that would then try to sell all the adjacencies, any services or other add-ons to the platform, so that the people who would sell the platform would go back to selling more platforms. And so we just worked with this aftermarket upsell, arguably cross-sell expansion sales team. And it was interesting because they were generally doing product-based pitches to say, you might also need this. And we brought our Why Evolve story framework, the Why Evolve story, which tells an existing customer, here's the good things that you've gotten from us so far. Here's the mutual investments we've made. Here's all the progress to date. We'd like to talk to you about some other trends and things you might want to consider. So instead of leading with, here's a new thing you might want to think about, we led with the impact and the investments and the outcomes, sort of warming up the audience to say, there's been a lot of goodness. There might be more where that came from. And so instead of leading with new, we led with the experience. And what we found is they too saw like a double digit, like 10, 11% increase in their successful aftermarket sales when they went from here's a new product you should consider having to here's what we've been able to accomplish together. Isn't that great? Here's some of the next things you should consider type of story. I know that was a little simplistic. There's a lot more to it than that, but the essence to say reinforcing the status quo bias, showing them how good it's been and saying there's a ton of momentum here, and then saying there's more where that came from is much more impactful, right? Reinforcing and leveraging your position as the status quo bias gets more upsell than just coming in with a bunch of upsell products and services.
I mean, it sounds a lot more like the way people would want to be sold to kind of naturally anyway. It's a really common sense thing. Hey, I've done all this good stuff for you. I think I could do more good stuff for you. Like looking at your business, knowing you for a year, here's some other opportunities where we can deliver on these great ideas. So
yeah, what we like to say is we have this amazing perspective now. Working with you for a year, we now know two things. We know what others like you are doing because we work with lots of other companies. And now we even know what you're doing. So we can kind of benchmark you, gauge where you're at. And then all of a sudden, your existing customer sees you as adding a unique set of value, outside and inside perspective, that then translates into them wanting to know what they should do next. They're like, wait, if you know what others are doing and how we're doing, can you benchmark us? Can you compare us? Is there anything I'm missing? And too often we just, again, lead with the upsell product, thinking that they're going to just know that they should want that and need that next. And the reality is it has to be a much more familiar conversation because you've been in there for a while. You've seen some things. They know you work with others like them. Add value by telling them what they might be missing in light of that interesting knowledge, right? That external and internal perspective. And I think that's what the upsell teams forget. They just go in there like it's another new product sale, and it's not. You're not coming in there to disrupt them with a brand new product. You're coming in there to evolve them to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that distinction of the different conversations is really important because it sort of sets the table for how you're going to manage that conversation. And if you don't think about it and empathize and contextualize the conversation, really dangerous stuff.
Absolutely. I think simply put, being fluent enough to understand, is this an acquisition story I have to tell where I have to be a disruptor and a dislodger and a defeater of status quo bias? Or is this an expansion story I need to tell where I have to defend, reinforce, and build on their status quo bias? And I know it sounds obvious now, but most companies we work with take a one-size-fits-all approach. It's like, here's the thing I need to sell, and here's the story I tell to sell it. And I think the science that we've been able to provide is that the psychology of the buyer is 180 degrees different. And as a result, your stories and your skills need to change to reflect the psychology of how the buyer's mind and how they engage you has changed for acquisition versus expansion.
I think I also want to kind of draw some parallels outside of your research. It occurred to me as I was starting to read the book, and again in the conversation here, that there's an element of consistency with the challenger sale, where we're taking this education approach. I think they call it like commercial education. And the fact that, especially in the defeating the status quo, we need to give them a reason to believe us. So part of this is going to be that the painting the status quo as a loss, clearly, but also we have to give them a reason to believe us. And so we have to be really smart about that. So I think fans of the challenger sale can come along on this ride too. I see the wheels turning there. So
yeah, so
tell me where I've gone off the rails.
So what I would say is challenger sale is half right, but it's not even quite half right. Here's what I mean by that. I think challenger sale is all about disrupting status quo bias, providing a piece of insight that's unexpected, and doing that in a consultative way. In fact, I think the phrase was actually commercial teaching. So you're teaching them something they didn't know. And that's in order to provoke them. It kind of came off of some of this research that Jeffrey Moore did originally on provocation-based selling. And then they called it challenger. So it wasn't net new original. There were a couple of people circling that same drain. And I would say that the why change acquisition stuff that we talk about, very similar, because changing someone's mind is hard. The problem with challenger, it is really just one trick. So I would argue that what we tested in existing customers was we used that provocative, why changey, challenger-like method in renewals and expansions, and it didn't perform as well because they didn't reinforce status quo bias. They didn't do these other things. And again, like it sounds obvious now, but it turns out you don't go in and challenge the status quo when you are the status quo. So there's more than a nuance in what you got to do differently between challenger and expansion. That
I'm sorry, I was really focused on that first move.
Yeah. So I would say I would say 100%, but the only problem is it's only 20 to 30% of your revenue target. So that's why we think, maybe we're a little biased, but our research in the book, The Expansion Sale, is for that other 70 to 80% where you're like, cool, I won the business by being super provocative and challenging, and you won the business by disrupting status quo bias. Now you actually have to keep the business by leveraging, reinforcing, and otherwise expanding on status quo bias. And that just takes a different flair. And so I would say that arguably, if you are a challenger shop doing it that way, awesome, keep that for your acquisition, but maybe take a look at the flip side of it, because we've tried to be very, very precise for those moments that I mentioned earlier, the why stay, the why pay more, the why forgive, and why evolve, which are different than what I think Challenger is just why change, why do it now, why do it with you. And so that's all goodness for that part of your targets.
And probably not enough focus on that loss of staying where you are, right? It's more like, hey, I have this aha for you.
It's implied, but it is not informed. It's not enforced enough. That piece of loss aversion isn't show up anywhere in Challenger. Again, we've taken the buyer's behaviors into account. That took the seller's behaviors into account. I should challenge. I should do this. I should do that. And as a customer, we're like, I'm here. Why should I change? Why should I do anything different? And, is my house on fire or not? The whole premise about new business is that somebody has to believe that their current safe is no longer safe. Not just that they're missing out on something, but they got to believe they can't stay where they are. That's just not brought to life enough in the original Challenger work, because it was about what the seller does, not about how the buyer actually processes it in their brain.
Yeah, they were very much focused on trying to improve the performance of the sales team, right? That was
right. And I think that's fine. But if you tell somebody to do something from a seller perspective and you don't know why it is or isn't impacting the buyer's brain, you could be really bad at it. Like you could not be a challenger. Then you could just be a jerk, right? So understanding what's going on in the buyer's mind when you are trying to bring that insight, when you are trying to provoke somebody, and then telling that story in a way that everybody believes it's helpful, can be a nuance, can be a fine line.
Let's move on a little bit. I want to talk about where this mindset is applicable. It's certainly not in the very low ARR world, right? If it's like a Canva, it's probably not thinking this way, with the $5.99 a month sale, right? Mm-hmm. So what are the kinds of companies that should be really focused on these techniques? Like, how do you categorize them?
Where we do the research is in areas where like a human in some commercial role still has to have interactions with you. It's not just auto renewal that is prompted by emails and pop-ups in your product. Although I think they could probably improve what's in their emails and in those pop-ups from using our insights. It's really about how do you structure a customer conversation, a business review, an upsell conversation, an apology. So where real humans with their lips moving are still important. So it's B2B and it's a more considered purchase, renewal, and upsell conversation. And so it's funny because there's so many industries now that have some sort of recurring revenue, contractual. I mean, I could be a heavy duty industrial company that's now turned everything into a managed service as opposed to just being a tech company with a piece of software. But almost every company we're talking to has some sort of, or moving towards some form of SaaS model. And a lot of them that are making this move are people who have been traditional, transactional, big ticket sorts of companies, and they don't necessarily understand the SaaS move. So our stuff has been really well received in those environments where they didn't even think of the fact that a renewal or an expansion was a thing. They just thought, I sold a thing, I went back out and sold another thing. And then when it got old, I tried to sell you the new thing. And it's a mindset shift for sure for a lot of these companies.
Yeah, it was really interesting as you talked about, the situation is more where there are humans with their lips moving. And I just was playing back the stuff that happened just before in terms of the pop-ups in your product and the, email conversions. And I bet a well-researched and reasoned approach using these techniques would actually work there too. It's my gut, is that it might be applicable, but it wouldn't be a consulting and training kind of engagement. But I could imagine people making the decision, hey, I don't need that, so I'm going to move on. So
yeah, I think your messaging inside of those moments, right? Those can be automated, triggered moments, but they still contain messaging. And I think if it's a renewal message or you're trying to upsell something, there's definitely some help in the research we've done to help you think about how to frame that messaging maybe more impactfully or effectively for your existing customers. Even if you're in automated mode as opposed to human touch points, there's still something fascinating about how your buyer interprets what they're reading as well as what they're seeing and hearing.
Well, I think that's a great place to land our episode. I could do this all day with you. I really appreciate it. If people want to reach out to you, learn more about you and the work your company does, what's the best way for them to get you?
I'll give you a couple. So the expansion sale is available on Amazon. It's a great handbook for this conversation. We have the company that does the work is called Corporate Visions, one word, corporatevisions, plural.com. And you can go identify webcasts and all kinds of content in there that would be helpful, as well as dig more into the types of services. So you can go straight for that book and use it as a guidebook, see if it can help. If you think you need some hands and feet to help you out, then you could go to corporatevisions.com.
Awesome. And if folks want to reach me on LinkedIn, you're on LinkedIn too, right? If people
I am.
want to do on LinkedIn, easy enough. I'm on LinkedIn/in/Ken Lempit. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Their podcast is distributed everywhere you can find one. And I'm happy to entertain any potential guests who might be interested after hearing this episode. Tim, thanks so much for joining us. This was awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks for listening to the SaaS Backwards Podcast, brought to you by Austin Lawrence Group. We're a growth marketing agency that helps SaaS firms reduce churn, accelerate sales, and generate demand. Learn more about us at www.austinlawrence.com. You can email Ken Lempit at kl@austinlawrence.com about any SaaS marketing or customer retention subject. We hope you'll subscribe, and thanks again for listening.